I made the acquaintance of Alban Berg at the Frankfurt Festival of the Allgemeine Deutsche Musikverein in 1924. I think it was in spring or in early summer, and it was the evening of the world premiere of the later very famous Three Fragments from Wozzeck. I was so tremendously impressed by the work that I asked the late conductor Hermann Scherchen, whom I already knew pretty well at that time, to introduce me to Berg, which he did. And after a very brief conversation, Berg accepted me without having seen anything of my own music as his pupil, and we fixed arrangements that I should come as his pupil to Vienna. I may say that at this time I considered myself primarily as a composer, and that I wanted to study composition with Berg, which I did. Now, at that time, I couldn't leave Frankfurt directly. It took about half a year before I went to Vienna at the beginning of January 1925. My first impression of Berg in Frankfurt at that time was one of the extreme kindness and one may say perhaps of gentleness. At the same time also the impression of a certain shyness on his part. Paid my first visit to Berg and had my first lesson at his apartment in Hitzing. This street, the Trautmannsdorfgasse, at that time appeared to me of an incomparable beauty. It reminded me in a way which I find hard to explain exactly of Cézanne, and it kept its spell over me to this very day. Before I entered the house where Berg lived and Mrs. Berg lived at the ground floor, I realized that this must be his place by a few dissonant chords persistently played on the piano. The name at the door was written in a very artificial typography, which was, as I later learned, drafted by Berg himself. It is the same typography which still exists on the titles of the original editions of Berg's Opus 1 and 2, with a touch of Art Nouveau, but at the same time quite distinct and without undue ornamentations. It seems to me very characteristic of Berg, by the way, that he once told me he might have become an architect as well. Of his visual talent, much remained throughout his musical development, not only in the calligraphical form of some of his scores, but also in other things. He once gave me a lesson, a kind of a lesson, I remember this, in the Café Imperial in Vienna, simply in order to show me how to write music in a calligraphically convincing way. He did not conceive time and the irreversibility of time as the primary force of his music, but more or less the spatial or visual order of the elements of this music. His voice was of an incomparable warmness, and when he answered the telephone by simply saying Berg, he always answered the telephone simply by his name. This sounded almost the same way as if other people say I. He was extremely tall. His reactions, his movements, but also his psychological reactions were rather slow. And this may account for the fact that he had rather a disproportional adoration for witticism, for intellectual mobility, and quickness of reaction. But at the same time, this admiration had also an element of affinity to what he admired, because he had himself a certain talent for puns. The father of Berg was from Bavaria. The family hailed from Nuremberg. But he himself was so thoroughly Viennese as one possibly could be. In this specific sense, that he quite naively presumed that the Viennese cultural climate and that what is taken for granted in Vienna is were a kind of God-given rule which ought to be accepted everywhere. He even found Prague, which during these years in the 20s and early 30s, what was in a way much more metropolitan than Vienna, provincial. His personal relation to Schoenberg was rather complicated. He was very closely bound to him, and he kept this friendship without wavering throughout his life, also in the Hitler time, when the blonde Gentile giant could have made life for himself much easier if he had complied in the slightest way with the Nazis. But on the other hand, his relation to Schoenberg was ambivalent, and Berg knew enough of psychoanalysis as to realize this himself pretty well. He was quite familiar with the Freudian theory. I remember that he once interpreted a dream of mine in which Schoenberg was the leading figure as a father dream. Incidentally, he also knew Freud just as Gustav Mahler personally. He once met him at a hotel in the Dolomites, I think, if I remember correctly, in Madonna di Campiglio, and Berg became ill, and Freud, who was the only doctor at the hotel, was consulted, but Berg took great pleasure in the fact that